As a photographer, I spend as much time sitting here at my computer editing photos as I do out in the field taking them. That's not something I've ever shown you, but today I'm going to start with an introductory lesson in how to edit photos in Lightroom. Welcome to Grant Takes Pictures. I'm Grant, and I take pictures. Today I'm just going to show you one photo that I took about 2.5 years ago in the Narrows at Zion National Park. This was one of my first excursions where I really wanted to be a little bit more serious about my photography. And this is one of the photos that I was able to capture. I took this photo with this Canon Rebel T4i. This is the camera that I dropped in the ocean last Christmas. So it doesn't actually work anymore, but I still have it because, well, I used this camera for a very long time as my primary camera. And this trip to Zion National Park was one of those times when I used it. So this photo is taken on this camera. It's a crop sensor, but this is still a wonderful, wonderful camera to use as an introductory camera if you are just looking for a camera to get started in photography. I used it for many years. You can pick one up used on eBay for about $250, and I highly recommend them. This photo was also taken with this lens. It's a Takana 11 to 16 millimeter f2.8 lens, and I loved this lens. I don't currently have a camera that works with this. This is designed specifically for cameras with a crop sensor. So this is a EF-S lens. So it technically fits on my 5D Mark III, but the image that it projects onto the sensor isn't large enough. So you get extreme vignetting if you try to use this on a full frame camera. But this was a wonderful lens that I used for many years for especially astrophotography. It's why I originally bought it. It is a relatively inexpensive lens that is fairly sharp from corner to corner, and it's pretty fast at f2.8. So it was a great lens for astrophotography, but I also used it for landscapes because I could get very wide images like this one. So this was taken at f11 on this crop sensor. So with the 1.6 crop factor. This is on a full frame camera. It's equivalent to about a f17-ish. You know, it's, let's see, did I do that right? 1.6 times, yeah, f17, f18, somewhere right in there. So that's 1.6 times 11 to get the full frame equivalent focal length for it. This is a raw image, and as you can probably tell, it's a little bit washed out to start with, maybe even a little overexposed, but I generally prefer that. You can see that there's nothing blown out in it. If you look here in the histogram, we are well away from being blown out on the whites, you know, not really dipping into the blacks too much. So it's a pretty well distributed histogram here. You can see here that I took it at iOS 200 for some reason, 11 millimeters, f11 at 0.06 seconds. So I was probably trying to get a little bit of motion here in the water, just a little bit of blur as it moved. If I was retaking this now, I would keep my iOS at 100, my ISO at 100, and you know, either adjust the aperture or even make it a little bit longer. You know, bring it up to 1.2 seconds, get a little bit more motion, bring the aperture down to, you know, f9 to balance that all out. It is what it is. So let's edit it as it is. So we have it in Lightroom here, and I'm just gonna bring it into the developer panel here on a Mac. If you hit Command Option 2 is the developer panel, or you can go up here to the top and hit develop. So to start with, I'm just going to bring in a little bit of contrast One of the things I try to do is to make the images I take look as realistic as possible. Try not to push things too far to make them look abnormal. But when you're shooting in RAW, you have to edit the photos some. If you're shooting in JPEG, the camera does all that editing for you. But if you don't do any editing, photos often look a little bit washed out and boring when you're shooting in RAW. So I bring up the contrast just a little bit, not a ton. I'm going to bring it up to plus 12 here. And then on this image, and on most images, honestly, I bring down the highlights substantially. I bring it all the way down to negative 80 because I really want to bring out some of the detail in here and in here. So up here in this corner and up here, or right here along the right edge of the photo. And I want to make those areas not quite as bright because they are not the subject of the photo. They're just around the perimeter. The shadows I'm also going to bring down, which will add to the contrast, but I'm not going to bring them down nearly as much as I brought down the highlights. Down here, negative 13, let's start there. And you can already see the colors starting to come out a little bit more, to be a little bit more vibrant. And I haven't even touched the vibrancy or saturation sliders yet. The whites I'm going to bring up, and I do this instead of bringing up the exposure. What I find is I'll bring down the highlights, the shadows, and the darks, which makes the image a little bit dark. But if I bring the whites back up, it brings out and makes a slightly brighter exposure. And then I bring the blacks down some, about the same amount as I brought the shadows, maybe a little bit more. But here we are, the green of these trees and the orange of the rocks are starting to really show through a little bit better. Now we get to my favorite slider in all of Lightroom, dehaze. Dehaze lowers the whites, brings out the blacks, and makes the dark colors more vibrant. I use it all the time. So in this image, I'm going to bring it up all the way to 50. This picture is starting to look a little bit oversaturated. The oranges are too bright, but we'll fix that in a minute. And oftentimes I bring up dehaze in my initial pass through everything, and then I back it off after I do my tone curves and everything else. And I will also bring up the vibrancy just a little bit most of the time. I'm not sure this picture is going to need it, but let's try to bring it up. And then I bring my saturation down. Right here, negative 10, negative 11. That's, for this image, probably a good place to put it. And, just try to suck some of the oversaturated colors back out. And as you can see, that has balanced out dehaze a little bit, especially in these brighter colors in the oranges, but leaving some of the saturation here in the darker colors in the river and in these trees over here on the left-hand side. So then I come down to the tone curve, and I almost always put a very minor S-curve on my tone curve. So if I just bring this up, 10, 15 in the highlights, there we go, 14, bring the lights up about half the amount that the highlights came up, so it's 7, bring darks down a little bit less than we brought the lights up, and the shadows down about twice what we did with the darks. So a very, very subtle S-curve here. And then, depending on the image, I will play with the HSL, the hue, saturation, luminosity color sliders. And in this image, these oranges are a little bit too bright. I like these greens for the most part, but let's bring down the oranges, bring their hue a little bit towards red, and the yellows a little bit towards orange, just slightly. And then let's bring the greens a little bit towards blue. So we're moving things away from yellow just a bit. I'm going to bring those quite a bit towards blue. Partly, I want to bring out the blue, or this green-blue color in the water a bit more than it is, without messing with the leaves of the trees too much. So I've pushed those colors around, and once again, the oranges of the rock side are getting to be a little bit too much. So let's bring down the saturation of the reds quite a bit. Maybe here, 23, 24, and the oranges a little bit. No, not quite as much. Now those rocks are looking a little bit more natural, not as radioactive. And then I want to really pop out the saturation of the greens and the oranges, the greens, the aquas, and the blues. So let's bring up the green just a little bit, the aqua substantially, and then the blue even more. And the goal there is to make this water look a little bit more blue. It's not affecting the colors anywhere else, but it will really help with that. And the luminosity on this one, I'm actually going to leave as it is. I often do this lens correction first, but as you can tell, it unwarped the picture just slightly, this profile correction, and then the chromatic aberration really didn't do much for the color on this lens. So everything we've done up to this point didn't make that much of a difference. The final thing I do is play with my aspect ratio. You will notice that almost all of my photos are 4:5 or 8:10. This is a really common size for printing photos, and you can normally get frames in this size, which is why I go with 8:10. It also works well for Instagram. I try to print my photos quite a bit. My house is, the walls are covered with my own photos. So I really like, printing the photos I take. And I try to make sure that the angle looks right. This one just looks a little off, but without a solid horizon, it's a little hard to tell. But I think that looks about right to me. And then make sure things are lined up the way I like them. I think I want to cut off this whole rock on the right side and include more of this rock here on the left side. If I split the difference, get a little bit of this rock here on the right, I only get a little bit of this rock on the left, and it feels just a little off to me. Alternatively, I could go this way, and I have too much of this rock here on the right and just the smallest sliver here on the left. I'm going to move this way, and then I think there's too much of this rock and sand here at the bottom. I'm just going to bring it up a little bit. I think about there looks good. So turn off the crop tool, and that is just about our finished image. So if you compare it, you can see how much more vibrant the orange of the rocks are and the green of the trees. It looks less washed out, and it just pops a little bit more without looking unnatural. This is pretty close to how it looked, maybe a little bit brighter than it looked in when I was in the Narrows, but this is generally how I go through and edit my photos. And I will change the amount of the sliders, but all of those sliders are ones that I touch on almost every image, and in those same directions. I bring up the contrast, I bring down the highlights and the shadows and the blacks, I increase the whites, I bring up the dehaze and the vibrancy while bringing down the saturation. I put on an X curve, and the HSL sliders I change on a per image basis. Many images I don't touch them at all, but on this image I thought it was needed just a little bit. Well, quite a bit, I should say. And then I do the lens correction. So that is my process for editing photos. So if you have found this video of an introduction to Lightroom editing helpful, hit that like button. I'm going to be doing these editing videos every Friday for at least a little while. I have a few here planned out for some different types of editing, some astrophotography, Milky Way editing, and some other things. So if you like it, hit that subscribe button. I'll be bringing you more editing every Friday. And as always, I still have my normal videos every Tuesday, at least as well as I can. We're getting some different things. It's not all landscapes these days, but pretty soon we will be out there taking some landscape photos again. I am sure of it. So hit that like button, hit subscribe, and we will see you again next week on Tuesday. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.